Hi everybody, welcome to another short lecture here in Travolution. This is of course Dr. Lillian Cespedes Gonzalez, and I am bringing you this here to our YouTube channel directly thanks to the support and generosity of all of our lovely patrons in PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee who support us and that are parts of our members community in the online space. If you want to become one of those people, which is the way that you can keep on supporting, by the way, everything that we do here on our virtual agenda, then the links are actually in the description of this lecture. And today I want to talk about something that I actually don't think a lot of people understand from a historical concept, which are the despotic rulers of Italy in the late Middle Ages and the so-called period of the Renaissance. And yes, I said despots. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people are kind of marvelized by the world of the Renaissance and how pretty everything was and all these wonderful, changes that we have in art and in humanist society and whatever, that we don't realize the vast majority of Italian societies were actually tyrants and despots. And why did I particularly perceive that this was a good moment to talk about it? Well, not just because, as many of you guys know, I do a lot of talks on art history, and therefore, context is key. If you don't have context to how things develop, well, you're kind of missing part of that. But I'm also doing this because I am sure you're all aware of the political panorama all across the world. And I think that perhaps some of the, let's say, concepts, ideas, whatever you want to call them, that a lot of these despots used to control and exploit power at the time kind of resonate a fair bit with some of our local magnates. And that is actually the best way to describe them. Local, regional, national, whatever. I'm not going to give exact names. I'm sure many of you have your own names in mind. But this is literally what I really want to talk about today, to give you a little bit of context about Italian history, which I don't think we normally look into, to give context to all of that beautiful art, and also to understand, I think, other Italian dynasties, which some people, again, seem to kind of not necessarily have a lot of knowledge about. So today, particularly, I'm going to be talking about the Este and the Borgia families, which are actually very important for the development of the Italian peninsula, but perhaps if you are not in the loop, you don't necessarily know where they come from or what they are important. And I'm going to really be coming to terms and helping you all understand what that idea of the despot, of a tyranny, is about. And in order to understand this, I would first like to introduce you to perhaps what is the core historian, scholar, whatever you want to call it, that introduces this subject, and that I think, particularly from the point of view of a researcher and a history student, you get introduced to very much early on into their work, which is Jacob Burckhardt. Burckhardt has been perhaps one of the key pioneers in the development of this concept of Italy in the sort of late Middle Ages to the Renaissance. He actually wrote a very important book called The Civilization of Renaissance Italy, and in this book he actually presents a model for what he believes is the key to the Italian despot, right? In his particular idea, the despotism that we see in Italy is different from the systems that had been established in some of these states during the Middle Ages. He actually has a quote that I would like to actually share with you guys. It's the earliest firm tyrannies in important towns were achieved by feudatories who owed their positions in part to alliances with Frederick II. And Frederick II, by the way, is a very important man and ruler in the Holy Roman Empire. In case you're wondering why the Holy Roman Empire matters so much, well, remember that the north of Italy has literally been in constant contention with the Holy Roman Empire. And at times, territories of the north of Italy have belonged to the Holy Roman Empire or to its successors, like the Habsburg Empire in the Austro-Hungarian form. So, being friends with your border frenemy is important in many ways, right? But, with the arrival of the Italian Renaissance, there are going to be some changes from the point of view of politics, from the point of view of society, from the point of view of economy, and all of these changes are going to sort of reframe what these despots are, I guess, out for. And what we realize is that, or at least what Buckhart realized, if we are to follow with his line of argument, is that these despots were actually meant to be seeking for fame and a passion for the arts, and having a scholarly court was, a very important item in these regards, because it gave them a sense of not just authority, but a sense of legitimacy. This is not necessarily new for, I guess, rulers of Europe, but the context in which it's going to be, developed is going to be different, because they're essentially kind of going to promote the idea that because they had absolute power, they were using this to maintain public buildings, churches, to keep the police, to, stop the environment from being corrupt, for being filthy, etc., etc. Sort of a little bit following the idea of the imperator from Rome, the actual original first dictators of the Roman Republic, which is, by the way, I shall remind you how Julius Caesar actually got into power. He was just supposed to be there temporarily, then he ended up there for a long, long time. Well, their situation, though, was very delicate, because despots could have a lot of enemies, as I'm sure you realize. And not just that, these are normally dynastic legacies, and different families have, different interests, and your interest could be your salvation or your fall. So they are very peculiar characters, and it's important that we understand them, because on top of that, what you also need to remember and realize is that, Italy was not a unified country at this moment in time. We have all of these factions, all of these families, which in many cases are not just families. They are deeply rooted in specific states, in specific cities, or specific areas of Italy. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. The north of Italy is not the same than the south of Italy. Rome has nothing to do with Venice. Venice has nothing to do with Salerno or with Palermo or anything. So, as much as it may be hard for us, diverging societal norms of these despots also have to do with the diversity that there is in a country like Italy, which doesn't seem very big, because frankly, in terms of territory, it's not that big, but it has a lot of diversity from many different aspects, okay? And that is why today specifically I would like to talk to you guys about from the point of view of the two dynasties of the Este family and the Borgias. So let's dig into that. And to get started, we're going to begin with the Este family, because I feel perhaps they're actually a very important family in Italy at this moment in time, but not many people kind of know them. I feel like in mainstream history they've not become as quintessential as the Medici, perhaps. But Este is the natal locality of the family, which is near Padua, by the way. They were actually very important because they controlled a lot of land in areas related to cities such as Modena, such as Reggio, Rovigo, and Ferrara. Ferrara particularly, which is going to become the capital of their realm. And in fact, if you go to Ferrara, which is in comparison to perhaps, Venice, Rome, Milan, whatever, considerably much smaller city, you are kind of always wowed, because the amount of power that the Este family managed to, accumulate in there really gives you this idea of this grandiose capital of ducal, if not royal, regal kind of background in many ways. In any case, their interest in the area had been apparent since the 12th century, when a specific member of their family, Azzo d'Este, married the Marcellessa degli Adelardi, who was actually heiress to the family possessions in that local area. And they developed a system over generations that lasted actually a lot longer than many of the other dynasties, particularly the Medici, because of the way they actually went on about it. You see, they decided to focus on very good diplomatical skills and in very strict administrative bureaucracy, which is also going to give them a very strict control of rural agrarian economy in that regards, and that will also give them a firm grip over the amount of rich people in their area, which is important because it's normally other rich people that are going to come to challenge, right, these despots. So they essentially play their limited hand very well and to their strengths, which, when you're about to build a system of oppression is kind of useful, I guess. Anyways. And because of this, the subjugation of the communal power and the local support was, well, in many ways made more manageable. And at many times it achieved success, which, well, also led them to be able to get to situations that other families in Italy perhaps didn't have. Like, for example, with this tight control they had, they were able to usurp a lot of church land that helped them, towards their supremacy. And as we're going to find out, messing around with the church in Italy at this moment in time wasn't always your greatest strategy. But because of the way they had played the cards and the way that they had built the system, it helped them moved onward. But, it was also key to maintain public order. They actually made their citizens happy, which was a major issue because, this moment in time, Italy is a place well known for rebellion. But, this they cared for food supply, for flood control, for irrigation. They had a proper legal system, and they actually developed a lot of philanthropic works and entertainment. So what else did the masses want? In the eyes of the oppressed, the Este were, wow, the best thing since sliced bread, because they were able to utilize, right? In so many cases, and saving the distances, of course, the Este sort of, build themselves in this moment in time in Italy a little bit like Singapore. Singapore has been, well, a despotic system because the same family has been ruling the country for God knows how many generations now. But the way they've gone about it is kind of a similar way. They take care of people so that the basic needs are covered, so that the system is thriving, and so that there is no reason for anybody to challenge the system, right? We have a saying in Spanish, whoever made the rules also made the loophole. So if you work on the loophole well enough, well, you can put yourself in this situation. And, this is also a family that really highlights itself because it's able to breed very, very good rulers, very good leaders. One of the perhaps most famous of them all is Ercole d'Este, who remarkably is perhaps one of the most unscrupulous leaders in medieval and early modern times. In fact, many of his characteristics will be, the key principles that Machiavelli will set out in Il Principe, which is, the thesis as to how to become a despot through and through in many ways. We actually believe that Ercole attempted to poison his rival for succession, one of those things. And although he did not totally approve of the marriage between his son and Lucrezia de Borgia, which we will talk about in a few moments, he will play his cards very, very wisely to, again, have leverage, have something that he could utilize in that regards to give him the upper hand. We also know that he was very good at utilizing, the development of policies, and he used a lot of his family members for representation, alliances, and marriages, which actually made him a very well-connected person and very well-supported. So he very much used the idea of every single person around him had a function to fulfill, and he would kind of place them so strategically. And again, I'm not suggesting this is new or different. If any of you have been doing the Golden Age of Spain with me, or perhaps are familiar with other, histories, this is a very similar situation to, for example, what the Catholic monarchs do with their offspring in Spain and with their neighbors, what the Normans did when they go to England, when they go to the Mediterranean. So it's nothing new, right? We're not reinventing the wheel, but not everybody uses these rules. Well, in any case, like I said about Ferrara being amazing, the Este were incredible at actually promoting the patronage of art during the Renaissance, and that actually will help them create a very good reputation, right? Because, reputation was key for despotic rule in this period because of what I've told you. It's not just about oppressing the lower class. It's about doing it in style and kind of creating PR around it. So, again, if some of these things are starting to resonate with some things you're seeing in the media, it's nothing new. History repeats itself. Be careful. Well, In any case, as I was saying, there was actually a lot of rivalry between all the different rulers in Italy at the time and beyond. But it is particularly important to say that some of the main rivals of the Este family were the Medici, which again were very famous because of their patronage of the arts. But if you've never visited Ferrara, I honestly have to say it's just as glorious of Florence, or if not more. I'm sorry, I know I am, as a tour guide, very well known for literally running the name of Florence through the ground and through the trash. I just have never been all that impressed. Not to say that aren't wonderful things in Florence, but I kind of feel that Florence, again, using a Spanish saying that I think makes a lot of sense in here, unos llevan la fama y otros cargan la lana. It literally means some people carry the fame while others kind of do the work to create the fame. I sort of feel that sometimes that's the situation with Ferrara. Ferrara, honestly, was such an important place. The court in there was full of Flemish painters that were ridiculously good. They had influences from Spain, from France, from Germany, from other Italian states, particularly from Venice, and even from Turkey, and well, of course what at this moment in time is going to be the changeover from Byzantium to the Ottoman Empire. So when you are able to portray yourself as such a big leader in culture, you can exploit it. Again, Ercole's role in this particular aspect was huge. He was one of the very first people who actually promoted the revival of classical theater, for example. He's gonna patronize very specific artists in the world of poetry to improve the magnificence of ducal power, which of course is again propaganda. And not just Ercole, but there are gonna be other members of the family, like for example Isabella de Este, who will become very remarkable. Isabella gathered one of the most amazing antiquarian collections that we've seen particularly from the point of view of a woman, and remember that Isabella de Este is the very famous woman who was painted for a portrait by Leonardo da Vinci under commission of the Pope. And Isabella d'Este was actually one of the people that we thought could have been potentially, maybe, perhaps, but now completely, taken aside the potential identity for La Mona Lisa. But not in this case. Well, there is, a bunch of different members of the Este family that clearly go towards creating this idea, which is it's not just concerned with their fame for the sake of fame, but because they want to create a historical image, a legacy, right? They had a dynastic mythology, if you like, that they want to promote, and they push for their noble origins, for their political claims, and the traditional virtues that are always associated with their family members. It was just essentially the most incredible propaganda you can imagine in many ways. And they even do this by developing, connections to the church. There is actually a specific member of their family, Borso de Este, who played a major role in this, because although the Este particularly had supported monastic foundations, Borso is actually going to get very involved with the Carthusian order, which are going to be introducing new religious communities to the area of Ferrara. And, in the world of the Reformation and in the world of, Christianity, having different versions of the story is interesting because it brings us new players into the story. So this is how the Este family starts developing their power and how they really create this idea of, like I said, despots that sort of take care of their people, but always to fulfill their needs. Now, let's go over to the Borgias and let's see if we have the same kind of despotism. Because again, whenever we're using these words and this language, and this is the reason why I think it's also why I wanted to do this session, so that we don't get very comfortable with the way we use some of these words and some of this language. There are many, many different ways of performing dictatorship. There are many different ways of performing despotism. There are many different ways of performing tyrannical rule. And it's important that we appreciate them, not just because it shines, it's golden, right? So, let me tell you about the Borgias, the spawn of a very, very successful Spanish con, essentially. Well, you see, the Borgias actually are a perfect new version of despotism because they were not local. The Borgias actually originally came from Spain. They were a modest noble family from the area of Valencia, and they go over to Italy and really are able to carve success for themselves. Remember, though, that part of Italy was actually a Spanish colony for a long time. We were returning the favor from Roman times, I guess. Well, in any case, their success is mostly possible because of the way they exploit their connection to the church. The Este had almost a finger in every other pie to move their own channels of development, but the Borgia kind of decide to put all the eggs on one basket. In fact, their connection to the church will mean that many different members of their family will become cardinals, even popes. And of course, when your brother, cousin, father, whatever is the pope, you can get away with murder, quite literally, in many circumstances. So this is actually what ends up kind of happening. Pope Alexander V, also known as Rodrigo Borgia, was actually a very, very powerful man. But the regime that the Borgias introduce is not necessarily just famous or important because of this abuse or use of the church. It's because of the, I guess, emphasis that they put in their own version of what power should be, their own version of what the extent of a state should be. The push for how much authority is too much authority, if you see what I mean. Because the authority of the Pope, right, could vary from one city to another. And that is something that the Borgia are kind of going to try to change. They're pretty much, in some ways, going to try to establish some kind of religious autarky that will kind of, impose themselves over their neighbors particularly, but not just their neighbors. Well, religion, as you can imagine, was going through a difficult moment in time. Many things have happened. The Reformation was literally approaching, and the legacy of some of these families will be happening later on. So, it's a tricky situation, and the Borgias very much are going to be able to exploit this problem for their gain. By the way, the Borgias were trying to centralize government overall in their lands, especially outside of the area of Romagna, of Emilia-Romagna, which had really been recently conquered. Because, again, you need to remember that the Papal States are not, at this moment in time, just the area around Rome or the Vatican. They literally owned half of Italy at some cases in history, and throughout time. So do not think of this tiny place in the map. We're talking of vast territory. Now, centralization was mostly based on opportunity and cheeky administration in many ways. That's how the Borgia managed to make the majority of their power. And that's how they're also going to create extra income, because money was going to be a particular issue for them. You see, Alexander actually managed to collect large amounts of money due to new taxes that he's going to create, particularly very heavy tithe rates. He's going to create a redistribution of cardinals, which is going to lead to distribution of parishes and therefore extra coin here and there. And because of this, he's also going to have the backup of people, investors, essentially. Investors are important. And in fact, he is partially responsible for the bills that were created to finance his crusade. We're already talking of the period of the late Crusades. It's not so easy anymore to actually get people over to the Holy Land, particularly because, disasters have happened. In the 13th century, the Mongols came over to Byzantium and kind of trashed half through of the Middle East. Not necessarily everybody wants to go over that way. And not just that, there is a lot of problems. The later Crusades are nothing to the first or second Crusade in that regards. So he's actually kind of going to gather money from a jubilee that he's going to make, and indulgences that are, of course, going to be created to play an important role in collecting money and supporting his ideology, his general, political agendas, so to speak. But the control that the Borgias exercise, unlike the Este, which were much more perhaps heavy on diplomacy, is violent. The Este were not faced by getting into trouble in that regard. While conquering the area of Romagna, which was not easy, they needed to use the majority of their papal economy resources to raise armies, which is a complicated subject. The militia from the area was sort of supposed to be used as an instrument of unification, but also as a demonstration of local support. But it rather looked like conscription in the modern sense, right? I guess what they were trying to do is, support the papacy, demonstrate your devotion, demonstrate your, ability to stand with the rightful power, when in reality what they were saying is, hello, dear peasant, come here, join our war, or otherwise we'll probably run over you or create a new tithe that will force you to enter service anyway. So the problems kind of are already rooting in the way that the Borgias create their power. But not just the way that the Borgias create their power. A lot of the issues that Italy is facing at this moment in time, and the areas that the Borgia are going to dominate, that are in conflict. This is a period of time where we have French invasions. There is going to be a rebellion in the area of Umbria, for example. Pilgrims are not necessarily going to be the easiest people to deal with during the Jubilee, swings and roundabouts. And yet, the crusade that Pope Alexander launches against the Turks is going to be very successful because of all the power that he's going to accumulate and the way that he's going to push people in the right direction. So that is that is kind of how the Borgia approach this in a different way. Interestingly, art is not necessarily something they are super concerned about. Not as much as the Este, at least. We know that there was, of course, a circle of scholars and artists, particularly on the side of Cesare. So Cesare, who is another member of the Borgia family, he seemed to be a bit more involved in this topic. But, traditionally, and this is not necessarily the nicest way, but Mallet, who perhaps was one of the most classic authors of Borgia literature of the last century, of sort of the 60s. And I know saying the 60s is like a very old type of literature, but, in history, something that was written in the 60s, if it's still factually correct, it's still factually correct. We don't need a new book to confirm or deny something that it's already been, I guess, proven to be right. But in any case, Mallet, at this moment in time, actually says that the circle that was around the Borgias was a crowd of mediocrities and nullities, of adulatory protesters and adventurers. So as much as there seems to be a circle of, people who are going to work on behalf of the Borgia, they don't seem to necessarily have the same caliber or the same fame than the Este, for example, or the Medici in that regards. We do know, for example, that Pope Calixtus III, who was the first Borgia Pope, had no proper dedication to art patronage, besides focusing eventually into the reconstruction of a lot of churches that had been ruined. So, we do know, though, that Alexander was a bit more involved into it. He's going to have a big iconographical project dedicated to the Virgin. He will restore other churches and create new fortresses, particularly Torre Borgia. But again, that's not necessarily because he wants to be a patron of the church, a patron of the arts, but because he has a political agenda of war. You kind of have to roll with the punches. But that is not to say that there were not, good scholars in the court. For example, Lucrezia Borgia was an incredibly well-educated woman. In order to have that degree of education, you need to be able to receive those skills from the right people. So, swings and roundabouts. We know that she spoke at least 4 different languages. She wrote poetry in all of them. She played music. She was an incredible dancer. She had a lot of administrative skills. So it cannot be that all your crew are mediocre people, if you see what I mean, if you are developing these skills, but perhaps they seem mediocre in the context of some of your rivals, right? I guess, I don't know, how can I put it? If you can afford only a Mercedes Class A, may seem the top of the world, from the point of view of ordinary people. But if the person coming next to you is running a Rolls Royce, then maybe suddenly you will feel a bit poor. We always need to be careful of these comparisons because, they can be leading us into situations that are not necessarily helpful to understand the world. But it seems that in the eyes of what other people were doing at the same time, the Borgia don't necessarily measure up in the same way. Not to say that they were not creating these kind of things, but they don't necessarily have the same output or not the same consistent quality of the output, which is important. Well, then we also have the problem that the succession in the Borgia family is a little bit messy, not to say very messy. We know that Alexander supported Cesare to achieve his goals, but things will just become complicated. It appears that most of the family members were very much servants depending on the Pope. Right? He's kind of the leader of the family, so you do what the Pope says. And that doesn't necessarily always play to their advantages, because in this period, links that had been established with other families were often quite relevant. And, Alexander had that in mind. That's one of the reasons why Lucrezia de Borgia had 3 different marriages, 2 of them at the expenses of her father and brother. But, by the way, and just for the sake of context, because I don't think I've actually made this clear, Alexander is the Pope, but his children are Cesare and Lucrezia. Yeah, one of those popes, one of those situations. In any case, moving on. This is actually the moment where we see this intersection. So you remember earlier I told you that Ercole wasn't necessarily super happy with the fact that his child was going to marry a Borgia. Well, this is kind of where strategy comes into play, and the reason why the 3rd marriage of Lucrezia, the Borgia, is going to be so important, right? Because in this particular case, it seems that Lucrezia is kind of marrying to improve her own situation, not necessarily to push the agendas of her father and her brother. So her marriage to Ercole's son, Alfonso, the future Alfonso d'Este, would actually make her Duchess of Ferrara, which is an important thing. It's an important, prestigious item. You're no longer just, servant of the Pope, because, a daughter of the Pope doesn't necessarily have the same ring than having the Duchess of Ferrara, in terms of legitimacy, in terms of propaganda and PR, doesn't necessarily, hold itself in the same particular, idea. Well, on top of that, we know that this union, so to speak, between Este and Borgia was kind of used to create some kind of counterbalance, to create an attempt to be allies amongst each other. Because if you think about it, Ferrara is actually not that far away from Rome, and it's not that far away from Romagna overall. If you bring up a map of Italy right now, you will notice this. Those borders, like I said, are very finicky, they're very tricky, and they need to be, kept into consideration. But again, one of the key ways in which the Borgia achieve fame is not through diplomacy or patronage or whatever. The Borgia are crusaders. And, frankly, should we be surprised that a Spanish family from the East Coast that had been in perpetual war of faith for 700 years shines at being crusaders? No, not really. But not just that. Alexander sees the opportunity. He understands that perhaps the easiest way for him to cash in is not necessarily get involved in the petty squabbles of the local dynasties, but actually, have a legacy that will not be forgotten. If you can claim that you've been the victorious leader of a crusade against the Ottoman Empire, against the Turks, I think people may remind you historically a bit better than, he was the guy that, created all of those beautiful palaces. In terms of the political context, it carries a bit more weight. And that, at that moment in time, was super important. So, now that we have, established the similarity situations between these 2 different families, maybe you have a better idea of what being an Italian despot and what being a despot is all about in general. Different families had different strategies, they had different ambitions, and they just, apply themselves in different ways. But it's important that we always think about what these concepts mean, how we use them, and how we need to be careful to make generalizations. Because, at the end of the day, they have nuances. And when we're looking at history, nuance is very important. Again, Can we say that the dictatorship of Franco is the same than Romanescu in Romania? Can we say that, the banana republics of the South American continent are the same than, likewise, the military states of certain African countries? Yes and no. There are points in common, there are points of divergence. But it's when we actually understand what those terms are supposed to mean and how we can manipulate them or explore them in different ways that we can reach a better understanding of the political spectrum. And again, the political spectrum right now is very, 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 very important, guys. I know I'm talking about, the quaint later Middle Ages to early modern societies of Italy in this moment in time, but again, history repeats itself. Just because Alexander was, operating so far away, nearly 500 years ago, does not mean that some of his political ideologies about the use of religion, and particularly Christendom, are not resonating with what some of our politicians are saying. Does not mean that what, the aggressiveness of expansion of Cesare Borgia is not similar to what some politicians are doing, the constant state of war in some cases. That is also not to say that there aren't, gigantic empires following the diplomatical Este spectrum of, hey, look at us, look at how shiny, how beautiful we look, but don't look behind the curtains because you're going to find the same thing that the other dude is doing. We're just doing it in a more, flashy makeup kind of way. So again, check your historical terms, make sure you're not misrepresenting them, and within that potential misrepresentation, understand what is misrepresentation and what is different variations on the same subject. And more importantly, next time, when you think that all of those wonders of Italy were done under such beautiful scenarios, democratic ideas, think twice, because they really, really weren't. But, again, just because these people didn't necessarily have the greatest political thoughts in mind or attitude towards their people, it doesn't take away from the beauty and the cultural developments that were performed in some of these areas. We need to be able to understand the bias and to detach ourselves from these situations now and then. And on that note, this is where I shall love you and leave you. Thank you so much for letting me rant about yet another political, historical event that I hope, again, brings you some ideas, about our own world, but also the past, and how we desperately need to understand the past better to make better decisions about our future. Take care of yourselves and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.